fund for holding down property taxes. I think the legislature has been trying to do that now for 3 biennia, and really, if there's a better way to structure that and make it more permanent through what the Farm Bureau is proposing, great. That sounds like something that we would really get on board. Baseline budgeting, I'm really curious to see what that is going to look like in the measure once they get it written, because at least in my mind, baseline budgeting is what local government does. If you look in the paper when your county publishes its budget, it always shows the budget from the previous year, and then category by category what they're proposing to change, increase or decrease in the upcoming year. And to me, that's baseline budgeting. You start with what you've got, and then you build from there. What's going to change? Do we need more motor graders? Is the cost of fuel going up? What do we have to do to make the changes? And then you publish that in the paper and let the citizens have a look and express their concerns. So I think that's, at least in my mind, baseline budgeting is another thing that would be embraced, because that's what we do.
A lot of people might say, and this is a criticism I hear all the time of all levels of government, is that there's always an assumption that all the spending that they did previously is spending that's going to happen again, and then they start tacking more things on, which is sort of how you described it. And I think, and I can't speak for the Farm Bureau, but I think when a lot of people think of baseline budgeting, what they're thinking of is you start at zero, and then you build the whole budget up again every cycle, saying this is what we need for the next 2 years. This is what we need, instead of let's just tack things on to what we did last time, which I think a lot of people think is a good way to maybe keep anachronistic spending in place, or a lot of wasteful spending that's maybe not necessarily needed. Baseline budgeting requires a review of the entire budget every single time. Would that be problematic if that's a proposal coming forward?
I don't think so. I don't know if it's a lot different.
I have a phone call. Dan.
When you're talking about essential services of local government, a small county has 5 patrol cars, sheriff and 4 deputies. Are you going to, whether in your budgeting process you go back and say, okay, we're going to have no deputies and no sheriff, obviously that's ridiculous. I think, you start with what the perceived needs are right now, and maybe you need less. Maybe the citizens are saying we need fewer cops on the street. That usually doesn't happen, but I think when you look at local government leaders, they're taxpayers too. They're sitting down, they're looking at what they spent last year, but they're also looking at what don't we have to spend, and maybe what we have to spend more on if the prices are going up. I think it goes both ways, and the starting point is probably not as important as making sure that every single item that you're budgeting for in the future years is something that's really needed by the citizens.
Why, in my experience with the budgeting process, it doesn't seem like there's often a lot of time spent on what sort of spending could we cut. I think there's a lot of time spending on, where can we get more money and how can we spend that money. That seems to be most of the focus. But
I disagree. I've sat through a lot of at least county budget meetings. I haven't been on a lot of school boards and city councils, but I can't imagine they're a lot different. And my county commissioners that I serve are generally a very conservative lot, and they don't like spending money, and that is a priority for them.
Okay. Well, why do you think the property issue has lingered for so long? Because obviously, I mean, we could go all the way back. What was it, the 2007 session? When the state first started, sort of getting involved. And we've gone through multiple legislative sessions where we've seen buy downs. We had an income tax rebate for a while. Then we had buy downs, and now we've got a permanent transfer of local spending, local school spending from, to the state, where the state is now permanently obligated to, most local school spending now. Why isn't this satisfying the public's appetite for property tax reform?
Well, I guess I don't know if it is or it isn't. People like you and I, we talk about it a lot. It's part of
2 callers, Dan and David.
Initiate a measure like the Farm Bureau is proposing will we'll see what the citizens really think about that. I think when you look back in history, you have to go a lot further than that to talk about where we are with property tax. I mean, when you go back to the last oil boom, we had a concerted effort in the late 70s, early 80s to drive down property tax with oil revenues. When the oil revenues went away and then the legislature was unable to raise taxes because the citizens felt that that was inappropriate, we saw a great shifting of the burden of government to the property tax. We saw more and more of the school funding coming from property tax. We saw social service funding climb. We saw corrections costs climb when the at the local level, when the state was unable to build the prison that had been recommended since 1986. So we saw a shifting there, and really what we're seeing now with the fortunate funding that we have in North Dakota now for coming from energy and other sources, that we can make the shift back. Frankly, the effective tax rate, the effective property tax rate now is as low as it was in the 70s, and it's great. We brought it back to where it was back then, and I think in the next few years we're going to see how the citizens feel about that.
Where does the local control argument? Because obviously we had a debate over Measure 2 to abolish property taxes, and that debate, at least for now, is over. But the argument from your side and from a coalition that you were in favor of was keep it local. But it seems like this shifting of local spending to the state level isn't keeping it local. It seems like that would be something that your group would oppose as a loss of local control over that spending, and especially when it's coming with no caps on, or very little, I think, in the way of controlling future property tax increases. It seems like local governments are making out pretty good, where they've got the state taking over more and more of their budgets with no real future controls on keeping property taxes down long term. I mean, that to me, I think is what my real problem is with the current property tax reform, is that we're shifting more spending to the state, which is real easy to do with all the extra revenue sitting around in state coffers, and we're not really doing anything to long-term hold property taxes down locally. That's my concern. How do you address that?
Well, first of all, I guess I'm not sure what, other than at the schools, what the state government has taken over for funding. But certainly in the schools, the educational costs, the legislature has made that determination that they're going to write themselves in for a bigger share, and I think that is a concern that local officials as well as citizens need to watch very carefully. Where is that balance between the responsibility to fund and the responsibility to decide what our educational priorities are? And I think that's an ongoing debate. I think there are some services at all levels of local government that may be more appropriately funded and directed by the state, things that have more of a statewide responsibility. But when you talk about local law enforcement, local roads, that sort of thing, you're really talking about local government having a better seat to see what the needs are, whether in a rural county 4 or 5 sheriff's deputies are needed. And I don't think the legislature is in a position to do that, and I guess I don't see the legislature writing themselves in for those sorts of services.
We've got a couple of callers on the line. First up, Dan. We've got a couple of minutes for we got to go to a break. What's on your mind?
Yes, I'm sure hoping that the referendum people to abolish the property tax get in gear again and get that going, because when you see the forecast from the Office of Management and Budget for the next biennium, the one not that we're currently in, but the one ending in 17, I heard Corey Fong say they estimate that just the sales tax, general sales tax, and use tax revenue will be in the neighborhood of $5 billion. Now, at the end of this biennium, it's over $2 billion and climbing, $2.5 billion, I think, right now. There's no excuse to continue having people taxed on the property they own when there is that much revenue, not counting even the rainy day funds and so forth. There's just no excuse for it. And these special exemptions for people that are going to buy a new home that the realtors push, or people who may be in a homestead tax credit based on their age and something like that. Why special exemptions for this and that? There's too many of them. Let's have one for everybody. Thanks.
Dan, thanks for the call. Mr. Traynor, your response.
I don't disagree that as long as we have the revenue and it's a priority with our citizens to lower property tax with that revenue, I would support that. Eliminating the property tax, however, I think is very it leaves the state of North Dakota very vulnerable. As we saw back in the last oil boom, the property tax was the only significant source of revenue that the state and local government could tap to make up for the loss of the oil revenue. And if you eliminate that entirely, I think we're putting our state in jeopardy, and I just don't think that's right.
All right, Terry, thanks for the time today. I certainly appreciate it.
You bet.
Eric Aasmundstad from the North Dakota Farm Bureau. Eric, first of all, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks, Rob. Good to hear you.
What exactly is it your organization is proposing for property tax reform?
Well, it's essentially a multi-part plan that first off, as you talked about in the last segment, it changes all reference of mills to dollars per $1,000 of taxable valuation. And the reason for that is people understand what a dollar is. Very few people understand what a mill is. So to remove some of the confusion with the jargon, just change it to an expression that everyone understands, and that's dollars. So there's a little bit of simplification. And then we move on to what I think is going to be the biggest point of contention, and that's baseline budgeting. Now, as you talked about in the last segment, baseline budgeting isn't necessarily going back to zero and starting over. That's zero-based budgeting. Baseline budgeting, what we're talking about, would entail a political subdivision sitting down, looking at what their budget was, making a conscious decision where to increase, where to cut, and moving a budget forth based on dollars. Not on mills, not anything else, a budget based on dollars. Something that's not necessarily tied to the valuation of property because it shouldn't be. Budgeting and taxation, or budgeting and valuation of property don't need to be synonymous. When we look at what's happening in this state with our property tax, and if you put this on a linear graph, you're going to see that property taxation in this state follows the same incline as does the valuation of property. Now, I'm a property owner. When I buy a piece of property, I want it to increase in value. That's why I buy it. So increased valuations aren't a bad thing. But what we've seen is we've seen our local political subdivisions capitalizing that valuation into taxation. And this is no different. What they're doing to us is no different than if somebody was to come in and put a tax on the unrealized gain on a 401k. This has to stop. And it stops by decoupling budgeting from valuation. That's what the baseline budgeting will do. Then, every 2 years at the primary elections, we're proposing that the taxpayers, the voters in the district, in the taxing district, have a chance to vote whether or not those political subdivisions raise their budget, increase their budget, and how much. That only seems right to us, that the people who are paying the bill have some say in how much they pay. Then that probably needs a lot more explanation, but that's kind of where we're going. And then we go into establishing a fund for property tax relief. Now, the state has done an admirable job of providing relief. No one can deny that. Has the relief been realized by the taxpayers? No, it hasn't. And I don't think you're going to find anybody that's going to disagree with that. We have testimony after testament across the state from taxpayers that say, yeah, my taxes went down this year. They certainly did. But they didn't go down as much as they should have, given the amount of relief that we received. One taxpayer in Ramsey County on a piece of commercial property saw their tax bill go down by $1,366. Well, that's pretty significant. But the state paid property tax relief on that same piece of property was $2,994. So those local political subdivisions kept $1,600 of that tax relief and increased their budgets. Now, not saying that it isn't needed, but they're doing that. They're eating up the tax relief that the taxpayers should be getting. Now, what this fund would require is that a dollar-for-dollar reduction in property tax be received. If that's happening now in a political subdivision, great. Those people are doing a wonderful job. But time and time again, we see that isn't the case, and the legislature is doing something that they're not getting credit for, and they have to remember they're not getting credit for it because they didn't take the extra step, and that was to require it to happen. Require a dollar-for-dollar reduction in the property tax bill for their tax relief, and the locals are eating it up. Now, the final piece of the puzzle that we're working on is if we're going to ask our local elected leaders to do a more responsible job of spending our money, and it's our money, it's not theirs, then we've got to give them all the tools they need to spend that money properly and to budget properly. And one of the big things that we have to do there is consolidate the dedicated levies. And, for example, say we had a winter without a lot of snow. Well, you have all this money stovepiped over here in the snow removal fund, and I can't use it over here to gravel roads in the summer because it's a dedicated levy. That's not the way to run a business, and or a form of government. So we have to give them the latitude to be able to move these dollars around and budget more, use those dollars wisely. So that's the quick and dirty explanation. It takes a lot more explanation than that, but that's kind of where we're at, Rob.
Let me going back specifically to the issue of voters approving local budgets, because you're saying that the baseline budgeting might be the most contentious issue. I'm not so sure. I think the voters approving local budgets. Here's what Jeff Esslinger from the North Dakota Association of Counties said in a Grand Forks Herald article by Mike Nowatzki. He said, I quote from the article, Esslinger also noted that local budget hearings are often poorly attended, despite changes in recent years designed to provide better public notice. People would be voting on every single budget, and I don't think people want to do that, he said. What do you say to that criticism? I mean, is that gonna create too much public involvement in the budgeting process?
I don't think it is. Yeah, people are going to vote on every single budget, but keep in mind, the state has been budgeting on a biennial basis now for 125 years, and it works. Our local political subdivisions can do the same thing. Now, they're going to stand up and say, oh, no, we haven't done it like that. That's not how we can do it. Change. Just change. You can do it. We didn't do this in a vacuum. We've talked to county commissioners. We've talked to school board members. We've talked to a lot of people that make these decisions at the local level. And they say, yeah, it's going to make it different how we do business, but we can do business differently. Business has to adapt all the time. So should government. So if we go to biennial budgeting for our schools, and the other thing we heard is, well, the school districts and the counties budget at different times of the year. How are we going to make that work? Change how you do things. And then bring this to the voters at every primary election, every 2 years, and let the voters approve or disapprove a budget. I have yet to see a time in the state of North Dakota when the taxpayers of this state have been asked to increase taxes, that if it's a worthy project that's been explained adequately, that the taxpayers have said no. So it's going to make our local elected officials more accountable. I think that people are going to love it. People don't have time to go to budget meetings Most people are at work when budget meetings occur, trying to make a living so they can pay the debt that's property tax. And make no mistake, it's a debt, because what happens if you don't pay it? You lose your property. This has to change. We're not saying do away with it. We're saying let's work around the edges to make the people that are spending it more responsible. Because how else do we pay for government services other than through taxation? So there's a need for it.
Why do you think it is that what the legislature's done so far? And obviously, and I asked Mr. Traynor this as well, and we've been dealing with this issue for multiple legislative sessions, going back 2007, I think, is the beginning of the current approach to where the states, sending more and more money down to the local governments. Why is it that fixing things? And we just went through with the states now committed to $660 million of local school spending. That's an ongoing commitment. And then they piled another $200 million of just sort of general property tax buy-downs on top of that. $860 million in state buy-downs of property taxes. Why isn't that enough? Why are people still so upset about property taxes?
Well, Rob, they wouldn't be had the state limited the locals' ability to continue increasing their budgets. Unfettered. This money has been going out to the political subdivisions of the state with no real restrictions. Now the state said, "Oh, we've done this, we've done that," but we put a cap on school districts of 12%. That's no cap. This money has been paid out, and the state has never said, "Oh, political subdivisions of the state, you have to not increase your budget." Now, we've picked up that local share, but the local share never ends because they never remove the taxing authority, and maybe they shouldn't. I'm not here to make that argument, but we have to get, as taxpayers, we need to get control back. And the only way to do that is go to a vote of the people. That is going to make the people that we elect to make these decisions much more responsible, much more thoughtful, and that's what we need to do. My gosh, the way we're budgeting now, and keep in mind, I'm not pointing at any one place or any one subdivision. This is on a statewide basis across all subdivisions. The way this is happening now, it'd be just like me going to my boss and saying, "I want to buy a new car, I want to buy a new boat, I want to buy a new house, and this is how much money I need to do all that." Instead of living within what I have and figuring out a way to make it work. There's no business or individual that is successful that budgets the way our political subdivisions do today. And I don't think it's too much to expect the same out of our government as we expect of ourselves.
Do you think, going back to the issue of voters approving local budgets, do you think that's going to create problems for the budgeting process? I mean, what happens if the voters don't approve the budget and they vote it down? Well, what then? I mean, when are voters going to be able to vote on it again? And is the budget going to be done in time and ready for the biennium cycle when the spending actually needs to take place?
People aren't going to vote it down, Rob. People know, as taxpayers, we know that the government services have to be paid for. We realize that.
Well, what's the? I mean, if you're saying they aren't going to vote it down,
if the county commission comes along and says we've got to have a 4% increase in our budget, tell us why. Explain it to us instead of just doing it and getting a bill in the mail.
Well, what happens if they do? I mean, what?
And if they don't, Rob, then they have to cut. But they don't have to. They can cut over their whole budget. What's a business do when revenues drop?
Yeah,
they cut.
Well,
it works.
I'm just wondering, as a practical matter. I mean, setting aside, who may or may not agree that a given budget is too high or too low or what have you, voters don't approve the budget. As a practical matter, what does the local political subdivision then do in terms of producing another budget? Do they put it to a second vote, and when does that vote happen, and how?
Well, if it fails, they have to go back and look at what they're doing and figure out a way to live within their means, because the taxpayers have said you're not getting any more. Or
Okay.
maybe the local political subdivisions have to go back to the state of North Dakota and say, hey, reduce this burden on us.
Okay.
Get rid of making counties pay for social services. Hey, state, maybe you should pay more of the bill for K-12 education, it being as it's constitutionally required. There's a lot of things we can do to run this better. I don't have the answers to all the questions, Rob, but we know what the problem is. And the problem is the explosion of local budgets, and the only way to get that under control is to get it back into the hands of the people.
Eric, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
I'm Rob Port, sitting in for Mike Capel. We'll be right back after this. If you want to join the program, 701-293-9000, 888-970-9329. Last segment coming up. What do you think? This is what the Farm Bureau is proposing. Is that going to fix property taxes? Is it going to make property taxes better? Love to hear from you. We'll be back right after this. Don't go away.
UN